hands trembled as he stared at the accusation papers spread across the worn wooden table. The ink seemed to bleed into his vision as his eyes scanned the words over and over again, each reading more devastating than the last. Animal cruelty, child endangerment, fraud, conspiracy to manipulate child protective services. The charges stacked on top of each other like stones bearing down on his chest, making it impossible to breathe. He sat in the cold, sterile office of George, a criminal defense attorney whose office smelled of old coffee and older regrets. George was in his 60s, with tired eyes that had seen too many guilty men claim innocence and too many innocent men accept injustice. His gray suit hung loosely on his thinning frame, and as he reviewed the case file for the third time, he let out a long, heavy sigh that made stomach drop. "I'm going to be honest with you," George said, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This doesn't look good. This doesn't look good at all." The photographs spread across the desk were like daggers. Recognized them immediately, pictures of Bailey, his golden retriever of 7 years, emaciated and broken. Bailey's ribs were visible through matted fur. His eyes, once bright and full of life, stared vacantly at the camera. There were circular marks on his legs where he'd been tied too tightly. Deep sores covered his skin where he'd lain in filth. To anyone looking at these images without knowing the truth, appeared to be a monster. "I know what this looks like," said, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "But I swear to you, George, I would never do this to Bailey. Never. That dog means everything to me." George leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Tell me again, carefully this time, and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they seem." Had told the story 100 times now to the police, to social services, to his attorney. The words had begun to feel hollow, worn out from repetition, but he told it again. "Sandra and I divorced 8 months ago. It was ugly. She wanted full custody of Emma, and I fought back because I knew Emma needed me. We have a custody arrangement, alternating weekends and Wednesday nights. This past weekend, it was Sandra's turn with Emma. On Friday evening, when I picked up Emma from school, I also expected to get Bailey back. Sandra had agreed to keep him over her weekend because her apartment complex has a yard and I was working a double shift." Paused, remembering that Friday afternoon. The sun had been warm, the sky clear. Emma had chattered about her school day as they drove home. Everything had felt normal. "When I went to pick up Bailey on Sunday evening, Sandra said she was running late. She asked me to come back Monday morning instead. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. On Monday, when I arrived at her apartment, she wasn't there. Her new boyfriend answered the door and said she'd taken Emma to her mother's house for the week. I asked about Bailey. He said Bailey had been acting sick and that Sandra had taken him to an animal shelter, saying she couldn't afford his care." George nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And you went to retrieve him?" "Of course I did. I drove straight to Serenity Valley Animal Shelter. But when I got there, they wouldn't let me have him. They said he'd been brought in by Sandra as an abandoned animal. They showed me pictures of his condition. I was shocked, horrified. I demanded to know what happened to him. The shelter director said they suspected abuse. That's when they called the police." "Did you try to explain?" "I tried. I told them everything. I said Sandra had been taking care of him, that I didn't know what had happened. But the police looked at me like I was lying. They asked where Bailey had been staying, whether I had anyone to corroborate my story. I told them about my neighbor, Tom, who saw me leaving with Emma and knew Bailey was with Sandra. But Tom never answered his door when police came by. I found out later that Sandra's cousin had paid him $500 to be unavailable." George's jaw clenched. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "The evidence they have, the photographs, the veterinary reports, these are damaging. The prosecution will paint a picture of a man who neglected his dog while he was in your care." "But he wasn't in my care," stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's what I'm trying to tell you." "I know," George said calmly, "and we'll argue that, but juries don't like nuance. They like clear stories, and Sandra has given them a very clear story, A neglectful father who doesn't deserve custody of his daughter and who abuses animals. Felt his legs give out beneath him, and he collapsed back into the chair. They've already taken Emma away from me. Child Protective Services says the home isn't safe. They're saying I'm a danger to my daughter because I'm capable of abusing Bailey. Sandra's been pushing this narrative everywhere, to Emma's school, to our neighbors. I'm becoming the town villain. George removed his glasses again and pinched the bridge of his nose. Have they charged you yet? The arraignment is in 2 weeks. They're planning to press charges on all counts. The animal cruelty charge alone carries up to 2 years in prison, with the child endangerment charge added. Trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Listen to me, George said, leaning forward intently. We need to build a timeline. We need to find witnesses who can verify that Bailey was in Sandra's care. We need to find out who the boyfriend is. He might be willing to testify. And we need to get an independent veterinarian to examine Bailey and determine the actual timeline of his injuries. I can do all of that, said, though his voice lacked conviction. But how do I fight against Sandra's story? She has time, resources, and apparently no moral compass. I have a construction job that barely pays the bills and a court-appointed lawyer who already looks defeated. You fight because you have to, George said simply. Because your daughter needs her father, because that dog needs the man who loves him, and because the truth matters. That night, sat alone in his small apartment, staring at photographs of Bailey and Emma together. Bailey wearing a birthday hat, Emma laughing as Bailey licked her face. Bailey protectively lying next to Emma when she was sick with the flu. These images told a different story entirely from the prosecution's narrative. In his jail cell, because bail had been set at an astronomical amount that he couldn't afford, made a decision that night. He would fight back. He would prove his innocence. He would get his daughter back. He would get Bailey back. No matter what it took, no matter how impossible it seemed, he would expose Sandra's lies and show the world the truth. He didn't know yet that his fight would lead to one of the most extraordinary moments ever witnessed in a Tennessee courtroom. He didn't know that a dog's unconditional love would become more powerful than any legal argument. He didn't know that his struggle would inspire a movement and change lives. All he knew was that he had to try. The morning sun filtered through the clinical white blinds of Serenity Valley Animal Shelter's medical examination room. Doctor had been awake since 5 o'clock, as she was every morning of her professional life. At 58 years old, with 35 years of veterinary experience behind her, had learned that animals didn't respect business hours. They suffered and needed help whenever pain found them. She stood in front of the examination table, looking at Bailey with a mixture of professional concern and something deeper, a gnawing intuition that had developed over decades of treating abused and neglected animals. Bailey lay quietly, his golden coat matted and dull, his ribs visible beneath skin stretched tight like canvas over a frame. The shelter staff had already taken their photographs, documented the abuse for the legal case against, and filed their reports. The case, as far as the administration was concerned, was straightforward. Animal cruelty, a clear-cut example of negligence and deliberate harm. But saw something different. She had inherited her intuition from her mother, a woman who seemed to know things without being told. Her mother had always said, "People lie with their words, but their bodies always tell the truth." As began her thorough examination of Bailey's injuries, she decided to listen to what Bailey's body was telling her. The emaciation was real, that much was certain. Bailey was severely underweight, malnourished, and dehydrated. But as carefully palpated his abdomen and examined his skeletal frame, she noticed something peculiar. The malnutrition wasn't uniform. His muscle loss followed a pattern she'd seen before, but not in cases of simple neglect. This pattern suggested medication, specifically the kind of medication used to treat chronic conditions. Sat down at the computer in her small office and pulled up Bailey's medical file. The shelter had obtained records from Bailey's previous veterinarian. Her eyes widened as she read through them. Bailey had been diagnosed with a thyroid condition 2 years ago. He'd been on medication regularly, a thyroid replacement hormone. The dosage was clearly documented, 0.6 twice daily. His mind began racing. A dog on thyroid medication who suddenly stops receiving it would experience exactly the kind of deterioration Bailey was exhibiting. The weight loss would accelerate. His coat would become dull and matted. His energy levels would plummet. But the critical question was, why would deliberately withhold essential medication from his own dog? She decided to dig deeper. That afternoon, called the shelter's administration and requested access to the security footage from the week Bailey had been brought in. Specifically, she wanted to see the footage from 3 days before his arrival, when the anonymous tip had come in. The shelter director, a practical woman named Helen, was initially hesitant. "The case is already solid. We have the photographs, the veterinary records. The prosecution has everything they need. Why are you digging into this?" Couldn't explain it adequately. She only knew that something felt wrong. "Humor me, Helen. Just let me see the footage." Helen sighed, but that evening sat in the security office, a cramped room that smelled like stale coffee and electronics, watching hours of grainy footage at double speed. Most of it showed nothing: empty parking lots, the occasional employee or volunteer arriving for their shift. Then, at 3:47 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, something caught her eye. A woman pulled into the parking lot in a silver. She was dressed in expensive athletic wear, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She sat in her car for nearly 30 minutes, engine running, watching the shelter building. Then, she got out, carrying a dog carrier, and entered through the side entrance marked "Emergency Drop-Offs." The woman was on screen for only 4 minutes but froze the image, studying her face intently. The cheekbones were distinctive. The way she moved, purposeful, confident, controlled, spoke of someone comfortable with deception. Didn't know who this woman was, but something about her face felt familiar in a deeply troubling way. She decided to do something she rarely did. She called the police non-emergency line and asked to speak with Detective James, the officer who had handled the initial animal cruelty complaint. When picked up, introduced herself carefully. "Detective, I'm Doctor from Serenity Valley Animal Shelter. I've been conducting the medical evaluation on the dog brought in last week, Bailey. I have some concerns about the case." There was a pause on the line. "Doctor, the case is pretty straightforward. We have photographs, veterinary documentation of abuse." "I know what we have," interrupted gently. "What I'm saying is, the evidence might be more complicated than it appears. Could you come to the shelter and look at something with me?" Detective was skeptical, but professional curiosity won out. He arrived 30 minutes later, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the slow movements of someone who'd spent years investigating crimes that had no good solutions. Showed him the security footage, then her medical findings. She explained the thyroid medication, the pattern of deterioration, and her theory that the condition could have been deliberately exacerbated. "Someone would have to know about the medication to deliberately withhold it," said thoughtfully. "Who knew Bailey had a thyroid condition?" "I've been wondering the same thing," said. "That's very specific medical information. His regular veterinarian would know, but who else?" "His owner obviously," said. "Yes, but also," hesitated, "anyone trusted enough to leave his dog with." The detective's expression shifted. He leaned forward. "You're suggesting the dog was deliberately placed in this condition to frame?" "I'm suggesting," said carefully, "that the evidence isn't as clear as it initially appeared, and that there might be another explanation worth investigating." Rubbed his face, the weight of complicated cases clearly etched into his features. "That's a pretty serious allegation. Do you have any proof of that?" "Not yet," admitted, "but I have questions, and I have a face from the security footage." Over the next 3 days became an amateur detective. She researched online, looking at news articles about custody disputes in the area. She cross-referenced dates and names. And then, quite by accident while scrolling through a local news story about a charity event, she saw her, the same woman from the security footage, identified in the photo caption as Sandra, local realtor and philanthropist. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She called detective again. "I found her, the woman on the security footage. Her name is Sandra, she's ex-wife." The detective went silent for a long moment. "That changes everything," he finally said. That evening sat alone in her office, the weight of what she'd discovered pressing down on her shoulders. She had evidence of a conspiracy, a calculated, deliberate attempt to frame an innocent man and ruin his life. But it was still circumstantial. She needed more. She was reviewing the medical files one more time when she noticed something else in Bailey's record. His vaccination records showed that 2 years ago, someone had purchased a large quantity of thyroid medication from an online veterinary pharmacy. The purchase had been made using an email address, sandra.property@.com. Stared at the email address for a long time. She had it, not just suspicion but evidence. Real, documented evidence of premeditation. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone. She had no idea who to call, what authority had jurisdiction over this kind of conspiracy. But she knew one thing, was innocent, and she had the proof. She pulled up her contacts and found the number for the only criminal defense attorney whose name she recognized, Sarah Martinez, who had recently defended a dog owner in a similar questionable case. When Sarah answered, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "My name is Doctor. I'm calling because I believe I have evidence that an innocent man was framed for animal cruelty. And I need your help." Sarah Martinez was eating a cold sandwich at her desk when the call came through. The office of Martinez and Associates, animal welfare law specialists, was deliberately modest, a small converted house in downtown Nashville with 2 paralegals, 1 intern, and Sarah herself running the entire operation on a shoestring budget and pure determination. The walls were covered with photographs of animals, dogs, cats, horses, even a chicken, all victims of false accusations, all now safe because Sarah had fought for them. Sarah had learned long ago that the legal system wasn't always about finding the truth. It was about who could tell the most compelling story, who had the most resources, and unfortunately, who had the least to lose. Animals couldn't testify. They couldn't hire expensive lawyers. And people who accused others of animal cruelty often had sympathetic stories of their own. Sarah had made it her mission to be the voice for the voiceless and the advocate for the falsely accused. When introduced herself and began describing the case, Sarah's attention sharpened. She'd been practicing animal welfare law for 8 years, and she'd seen enough suspicious cases to recognize the patterns of deliberate sabotage. But this was different. This was premeditation combined with custody manipulation. This was cruelty designed not just to harm an animal, but to destroy a human life. "I'm listening," Sarah said, setting down her sandwich and pulling out a legal pad. "Tell me everything." For the next 45 minutes, walked Sarah through her findings. The thyroid medication, the security footage, the email address proving Sandra had purchased the medication in advance. The timeline that showed Bailey's condition could only have deteriorated during Sandra's custody period. By the time finished, Sarah's legal mind was already several steps ahead, planning strategy. "I need to see everything," Sarah said urgently. "The security footage, the medical records, the email evidence. Can you get me access to Bailey?" "I can do better than that," replied. "I can get you access to Bailey and a direct line to detective, who's starting to believe something bigger is happening here." "Perfect, I'm coming to you. Stay there. We're going to build a case that's going to blow this thing wide open." When Sarah arrived at Serenity Valley Animal Shelter 90 minutes later, she was immediately struck by 2 things. First, by Bailey himself, who was lying on a cushion in the medical wing, his dark eyes watching her with an intelligence and sadness that broke her heart. And second, by intensity. The doctor was waiting with files organized meticulously, color-coded tabs indicating different categories of evidence. "This woman," Sarah said, studying the security footage image of Sandra, "is a professional. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated and deliberate. She purchased enough thyroid medication on December 15th to suppress for 3 months," explained, pulling up the online pharmacy receipt. "The order was placed using her business email. She's not even trying to hide it because she never thought anyone would look closely enough." Sarah's legal mind began assembling the pieces into a coherent narrative. The custody dispute, she's losing in court, is fighting hard to keep Emma, so she needs to destroy his credibility. She needs to prove he's dangerous, unfit, incapable of caring for anything. "Exactly," confirmed. "And the animal cruelty charge is perfect for that. It's emotional. It makes juries angry. It's exactly the kind of thing that makes judges take away custody." Sarah stood and began packing, a habit she developed over years of thinking through complex problems. "We need to investigate her. We need to understand her finances, her communications, her desperation. We need to know why she was willing to go this far." "There's something else," said hesitantly. "The neighbor who reported finding Bailey, the one who went to the police, I think there's a connection." Pulled up a document on her computer. "I did some research. The neighbor's name is Tom Henderson. I found a social media post from 3 years ago where he tagged Sandra in a family photo. They're cousins." Sarah stopped packing. "She paid him. Tell me you found proof of that." "Not yet," admitted. "But if we can find a financial transaction, anything showing money transferred between them." "Then we've got conspiracy," Sarah finished. She pulled out her phone and called her paralegal. "I need you to subpoena Tom Henderson's bank records immediately, and get me everything you can find on Sandra's financial accounts, personal and business. I need to know where money is moving." Over the next 10 days, Sarah's small office became mission control for the defense. She worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, fueled by coffee and the conviction that justice required their effort. She interviewed Detective multiple times, convincing him to re-examine the case with fresh eyes. She subpoenaed pharmacy records. She hired a forensic accountant who discovered exactly what they were looking for: a transfer of $500 from Sandra's account to Tom Henderson's account on the day before Bailey was reported as abandoned. But Sarah knew that money trail alone wouldn't be enough. She needed more. She needed to understand the full scope of Sandra's plan. She requested surveillance footage from Sandra's apartment building and discovered something remarkable. On the morning Bailey had been taken, there were 6 different trips Sandra made to the veterinary clinic, each time staying for only 5 to 10 minutes. Through careful detective work, Sarah obtained records showing that Sandra had been purchasing medications, including expensive thyroid suppressants, from multiple veterinary clinics under different pretexts, each time claiming it was for her own pet. The picture became crystal clear. Sandra had deliberately been collecting thyroid medication, deliberately withholding it from Bailey during the custody weekend, and deliberately photographing his deterioration to create a false narrative of abuse. When Sarah finally met in person for the first time, she brought with her. They sat in a small interview room at the jail, and Sarah laid out her findings carefully, watching as face transformed from despair to cautious hope. "You're telling me you can prove I didn't do this?" asked, his voice breaking. "I'm telling you that I can prove someone else did it," Sarah corrected. "And that someone is Sandra. The evidence is circumstantial in some places, but the totality of it is devastating to her credibility." Put his head in his hands and wept, not from sadness, but from the first genuine hope he'd felt since this nightmare began. Sarah leaned forward. "But I want to do something unconventional, something that's never been done before in a case like this. I want to bring Bailey into the courtroom during trial." Looked up, confusion in his eyes. "What? Why?" "Because the jury needs to see something that can't be manufactured, can't be argued against, can't be twisted into a false narrative," Sarah explained, her eyes blazing with determination. "They need to see the truth of your relationship with Bailey written in his behavior. A dog that was truly abused and starved by you would react with fear. Bailey's going to react with love, and no amount of clever prosecution can argue against that." Nodded supportively. "Dogs don't lie. Their bodies, their behavior, their instincts. They're honest in a way human testimony can never be." Stared at Sarah in wonder. "You really think that will work?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that it's our best chance at showing the jury something real, something genuine, something that transcends legal argument and speaks directly to their hearts." That night, Sarah returned to her office and began drafting the motion to bring Bailey into the courtroom. She knew it would face opposition. She knew Judge Harrison would be skeptical, but she also knew that sometimes justice required taking risks that seemed impossible. She worked through the night, crafting her arguments with precision and passion. She researched similar cases. She found behavioral science studies. She built a legal foundation that, while unconventional, was ironclad in its reasoning. By dawn, as the Nashville skyline transformed from black to purple to gold, Sarah sat back and read through her motion one final time. It was bold. It was risky. It was unconventional. It was also their best chance at saving an innocent man's life. She hit send on the email to the court, and then she called. "I've filed the motion," she said simply. "Now we wait." Tennessee State Courthouse in Nashville stood like a sentinel of justice, its marble columns reaching toward a pale winter sky. Inside Courtroom 7B, Judge Robert Harrison sat at the bench reviewing the morning's docket when his clerk approached with a stack of documents. The judge was 64 years old, appointed to the bench 30 years ago after a distinguished career as a criminal prosecutor. He was known for being fair but firm, traditional in his approach, and deeply skeptical of anything that smacked of courtroom theatrics. When he read Sarah's motion, his eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into his receding hairline. "Bring the dog into court," he muttered to himself, reading the motion twice more to ensure he wasn't hallucinating. "This woman is either brilliant or insane." Judge Harrison scheduled a pretrial hearing specifically to address the motion. This wasn't something he could simply grant or deny. It required careful consideration, legal arguments, and a thorough understanding of exactly what Sarah was proposing and why. The morning of the hearing, the courtroom filled quickly. Word had spread through the legal community that something unusual was happening. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and curious onlookers packed the gallery. Sarah sat at the defense table, perfectly composed despite the chaos swirling around her. Beside her, looked terrified. George, the original attorney, sat in the back row, watching with an expression of cautious interest mixed with skepticism. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana, arrived looking supremely confident. She'd handled dozens of animal cruelty cases and had never lost. She viewed this motion as a desperate Hail Mary pass from a defense attorney running out of legitimate options. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "I've reviewed your motion. Before I rule on it, I'd like to hear your arguments. And I want them to be good arguments because what you're asking is highly irregular." Sarah stood, her posture radiating quiet confidence. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, researching case law, studying canine behavior science, and anticipating every objection the prosecution might raise. "Your Honor, thank you for hearing this motion. What I'm proposing is unconventional, yes, but it's also deeply rooted in established behavioral science and legal precedent. I'm not asking to put the dog on a witness stand or to make theatrical gestures. I'm asking permission for the jury to observe the defendant's genuine relationship with this animal under circumstances that cannot be fabricated or misrepresented. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair. Ms. Martinez, animals have never been permitted to testify or participate in trials in this manner. There's good reason for that. How do you respond to the obvious concern that this is pure emotion and manipulation? Your Honor, Sarah continued, I would argue that what I'm proposing is actually evidence. Let me explain. The prosecution's narrative requires that my client deliberately starved and abused this dog over an extended period. But canine behavior science tells us something very specific. A dog that has been genuinely abused, traumatized, and starved by a human would display one of three behavioral responses to that person: fear, avoidance, or aggression. The dog cannot consciously lie about its experiences. Its body language, its instinctive responses, these are objective evidence of its treatment history. Diana stood abruptly. Your Honor, I must object. This is nonsense. A dog's behavior is not objective evidence of anything. It's an animal's unpredictable reaction. The defense is asking permission to conduct a circus act designed to manipulate the jury's emotions. I understand your concern, Sarah said calmly, addressing the prosecution directly. But the prosecution has no reason to fear this. If my client did in fact abuse this dog, Bailey would demonstrate fear or aggression toward him. That would support the prosecution's case. I'm confident enough in my client's innocence that I'm willing to risk the dog's true reactions being witnessed by the jury. Can the prosecution say the same? Judge Harrison held up his hand. Ms. Martinez, you've made an interesting argument, but I need you to give me something more substantial than theory. Give me case precedent or scientific evidence that supports what you're asking. Sarah pulled out a thick file. Your Honor, I've compiled research from the International Society of Canine Behaviorists, peer-reviewed studies on trauma in animals, and several cases where similar behavioral evidence has been admitted in other jurisdictions. I've also included testimony from a veterinary behaviorist from the University of Tennessee, who is willing to testify about the specific behavioral patterns we would expect to see in this situation. She distributed the files to the judge, the prosecution, and the court clerk. Judge Harrison spent the next 30 minutes reading through the material, his expression shifting from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. Sarah continued, has reviewed Bailey's medical history, behavioral records from the shelter, and has examined the dog personally. She's prepared to testify that Bailey's behavior is consistent with a dog who has been loved and cared for, not abused. And furthermore, Your Honor, I'm proposing specific, controlled conditions for Bailey's appearance in court. He would be brought in during a designated moment. He would not be used as a prop or paraded around. He would simply be present, and the jury would be permitted to observe the interaction between the defendant and the animal. Diana stood again, her voice sharp with frustration. Your Honor, this is still manipulation. A jury seeing a man reunite with his dog is going to react emotionally regardless of guilt or innocence. The prosecution cannot effectively cross-examine a dog. This violates every principle of fair trial procedure. I disagree, Sarah said evenly. The prosecution can absolutely cross-examine the evidence. They can present their own behavioral expert. They can argue that Bailey's reactions prove nothing. But they cannot argue away what the jury will witness with their own eyes. And isn't that what a trial is supposed to be about? The truth, observed directly. Judge Harrison set down his reading glasses and studied both attorneys carefully. The courtroom had fallen absolutely silent. Everyone understood they were witnessing something significant. Ms. Martinez, the judge finally said, I want to understand the mechanics of this. You're not asking Bailey to testify to anything. You're simply asking that he be present in the courtroom during your client's testimony. Precisely, Your Honor. I would have Dr. Bailey's caretaker at the shelter bring him in. She would hold his leash. My client would remain seated at the defense table. The jury would be instructed that they are observing an animal's natural behavioral responses, nothing more. Then doctor would testify as to what those responses mean in the context of animal welfare and trauma. And if the dog becomes disruptive, then he's immediately removed. Your Honor, I'm asking permission, but I'm also accepting full responsibility for any disruption. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture everyone in the courtroom recognized as a sign of deep internal conflict. He spent another long moment in silence, clearly wrestling with the decision. Ms. Martinez, I want to be very clear about something, he finally said. If I grant this motion, it will be unprecedented in this jurisdiction. I will be opening myself up to appeal, to criticism, to questions about judicial propriety. So before I decide, I need to know, do you genuinely believe this evidence is necessary to prove your client's innocence? Or is this a desperate gamble? Sarah met his eyes directly. Your Honor, I believe the evidence is necessary. I believe Bailey's behavior will reveal the truth more clearly than any testimony or document. And I believe that justice sometimes requires us to be willing to try unconventional methods when the stakes are this high. The judge was quiet for another long moment. Then he looked toward Diana. Ms., do you have any additional arguments? Only that this sets a terrible precedent, Your Honor. Next, we'll have cats and parrots testifying in courtrooms across the state. That's not what this is, Judge Harrison said quietly. This is one specific case with specific circumstances. He turned back to Sarah. I'm going to grant your motion, but understand the conditions. Bailey enters court once, at a moment I designate. He remains for no more than 10 minutes. Any disruption and he's removed immediately. The jury will be specifically instructed that they are observing an animal's behavioral responses and nothing more, and doctor will testify as an expert witness about what those responses mean. Am I understood? Understood and agreed, Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming relief flooding through her. As the gavel came down, Sarah caught the surprised expression on Diana's face. The prosecution had been so certain this motion would be dismissed. They had never prepared for the possibility that it would be granted. But more importantly, Sarah saw the look on his face, the first genuine spark of hope she'd seen since they met. That evening, Sarah called and with the news. When heard that Judge Harrison had approved the motion, he wept openly. Bailey's coming to court, he whispered into the phone. My dog is going to help save my life. Sarah hung up the phone and sat alone in her office as darkness fell over Nashville. She had just taken an enormous gamble. She had staked her client's fate on the honesty of an animal. But looking at the research again, reading through doctor's notes, reviewing Bailey's behavioral records, Sarah felt absolutely certain of one thing. She had chosen the right strategy. What she didn't know yet was exactly how powerful that strategy would prove to be. The trial had been going on for 6 days when everything changed. 6 days of testimony that felt like 6 years. 6 days of listening to Sandra describe as a monster, of watching veterinary photographs of Bailey's emaciated frame pass before the jury's eyes, of sitting in a courtroom where the evidence seemed to march inexorably toward a guilty verdict. The prosecution had rested their case that morning. They were confident, smugly, definitively confident. They had presented a narrative so compelling, so damning, that Evan's own body language had begun to betray him. He slumped in his chair, looking every bit the guilty man they had painted him to be. Sarah's defense had been methodical and scientific. She'd presented expert witnesses, doctor discussing canine behavior, a forensic accountant detailing the suspicious financial transfers, detective providing testimony about the inconsistencies in the timeline. The jury listened politely, but Sarah could see the doubt in their eyes. The prosecution's emotional narrative had struck deeper than logic and evidence could penetrate. That was why everything hinged on this moment. Judge Harrison had instructed everyone that Bailey would be brought into the courtroom during testimony. It was Friday afternoon, the time when jurors were tired, when attention spans flagged, when the reality of the weekend was beginning to intrude on their concentration. Sarah had specifically requested this timing. She wanted them weary, emotionally saturated, ready to witness something real rather than endure more argument. Sat at the defense table, his hands visibly shaking. He'd been in and out of jail for months. He hadn't seen Bailey since the day the dog was taken by animal control. He didn't know how Bailey would react to him. He didn't know if the dog would remember him. The fear was almost paralyzing. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "He'll remember," she whispered. "Trust me." At 2:47 p.m. on that Friday afternoon, Judge Harrison entered the courtroom after a brief recess. The jury filed back in, some of them carrying coffee cups, the judge's clerk settling into her chair. Everything felt routine, ordinary, just another afternoon in a trial that had begun to feel endless. "Mr. Judge," Harrison said formally, "you may take the stand. You will be questioned by your attorney about the events in question." Stood on shaky legs and walked to the witness stand. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Sarah approached him with her legal pad, ready to begin his testimony. But before she could ask the first question, Judge Harrison made an announcement. "Before we proceed, I want to inform the jury that something unusual is about to happen in this courtroom. The defense has requested, and I have approved, the presence of the animal at the center of this case. Bailey will be brought into the courtroom shortly. I want to be very clear. You are to observe the animal's natural behavioral responses. Nothing more. This is not a performance. This is not testimony. This is the observation of an animal's actual reactions to stimuli present in the courtroom." The jury visibly stiffened. Several jurors exchanged confused glances. Diana, the prosecutor, sat forward in her chair, her jaw clenched. The courtroom doors opened. Doctor walked in, holding the leash of Bailey. The golden retriever was groomed to perfection. After months at the shelter and weeks of rehabilitation, Bailey's coat shone like liquid gold under the courtroom lights. His posture was alert but calm. He walked beside with the easy confidence of a dog who trusted his handler completely. The jury's attention shifted instantly and completely to Bailey. One juror, an older woman in the front row, gasped audibly. Another juror leaned forward, his eyes widening. Then Bailey caught the scent. It was subtle at first, just a shift in his nose, a slight tilting of his head. But then his entire body responded. His ears perked. His nostrils flared. He had caught scent, and every nerve ending in his body ignited with recognition. Bailey's head turned slowly toward the witness stand. When the dog's eyes found, time seemed to stop. For a moment, there was absolutely nothing, just a dog and a man staring at each other across a courtroom. Then Bailey's entire body began to tremble, not from fear, from recognition, from a love so pure and so undeniable that it transcended species and language and courtroom protocol. His hands flew to his mouth, tears already streaming down his face. Bailey's tail began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. The dog whimpered, a sound so filled with longing and joy and reunion that several jurors gasped. The handler maintained her grip on the leash, but she wasn't fighting against Bailey. The dog simply stood and stared, trembling, his entire being focused on the man in the witness stand. One juror openly wept. Another covered her mouth with her hand. The entire courtroom had fallen into a profound silence, the kind of silence that only occurs when people are witnessing something deeply true, something that cannot be manufactured or argued against. Bailey took a small step forward, straining gently against the leash. His whimpering continued, a sound that seemed to bypass all rational thought and speak directly to something primal in human hearts. This was no trained performance. This was no dog performing tricks. This was pure, unfiltered emotion. "He remembers," whispered a juror in the back row, loud enough for several people to hear. Stood up from the witness stand, his eyes locked on Bailey. "Bailey," he called softly, his voice breaking with emotion. "Hey buddy, it's me. It's your dad." Bailey's body went rigid, then began to shake more violently. The dog started to vocalize, not barking, but whining, a sound of desperate need and overwhelming joy. Every instinct in the animal was screaming to go to close the distance, to be reunited with his person. Let the leash out slightly, allowing Bailey a few more steps toward, but maintaining careful control. She understood the significance of what was happening. The entire defense depended on this moment remaining dignified, powerful, genuine. Emma's daughter, who had been sitting in the back with her grandmother, began to cry. She remembered Bailey. She remembered the dog who had slept on her bed when she was sick, who had licked away her tears when her parents fought, who had been her faithful companion through the darkest months of her young life. Judge Harrison sat silently, his hand resting on his gavel, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Even he, with 3 decades of judicial experience, seemed moved by what was happening before him. The prosecutor sat rigidly in her chair, her face flushed, her jaw working but no words coming out. She had no objection to lodge against an animal's love. There was no legal mechanism to argue against what the jury was witnessing. Sarah observed the jury's faces carefully. She saw the old woman in the front row shaking her head slowly, her expression transformed. She saw a middle-aged man wiping his eyes. She saw young people, older people, men and women, all united in the recognition of something authentic and undeniable. This was truth in its form. Bailey's behavior continued for nearly 5 minutes, the trembling, the whimpering, the absolute unwavering focus on. The dog's body language was clear to anyone with even basic knowledge of animal behavior. This was a dog greeting someone he loved deeply, someone he trusted implicitly, someone who had been his person before they were separated. Finally, Judge Harrison gently raised his hand. "Ms., I believe we've seen what we needed to see. Please remove Bailey from the courtroom." Her own eyes wet with tears, gently led Bailey back toward the doors. As they walked away, Bailey turned his head backward, trying to maintain eye contact with for as long as possible. He whimpered one final time, a sound so filled with longing that even the bailiff had to turn away. The courtroom doors closed. In the silence that followed, sat back down in the witness stand, his entire body shaking with emotion. He buried his face in his hands and wept openly, not from despair, but from the overwhelming release of months of tension and fear and separation. Sarah stood quietly, giving the moment its weight. She didn't rush into questioning. She let the jury sit with what they had just witnessed. Finally, after 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, she approached the stand. "Mister, I know this is difficult, but I'd like to ask you about your relationship with Bailey." Looked up, his eyes red, his voice rough with emotion. "Bailey was my best friend. He was Emma's best friend. I would never hurt him. Never. That dog saved my life more times than I can count, and I just wanted him to know." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every person in that courtroom had just witnessed the truth that words could never adequately express. When Sarah glanced at the jury, she saw something that made her heart soar. The old woman in the front row was nodding slowly, as if she had just come to a profound realization. Several other jurors were no longer watching. They were staring down at their hands, lost in thought, their certainties shaken. The prosecution had presented evidence, but Bailey had presented truth. And in the hearts of 12 jurors, truth was beginning to triumph over narrative. The courtroom remained suspended in the emotional aftermath of Bailey's appearance. Even after Doctor had led the dog away, even after the doors had closed, the atmosphere lingered heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Jurors still wiped their eyes. The bailiff maintained an unusually kind expression. The very air seemed to have shifted. Sarah allowed the silence to persist for another 30 seconds before she continued. Mister, I know this is emotional for you. I'd like to continue your testimony by asking about your typical relationship with Bailey. Can you describe your daily life with him? Took several deep breaths, attempting to compose himself. His voice was still rough with emotion, but determination hardened his words. Bailey was my companion. Every morning he would wake me up by jumping on the bed and licking my face. Every single morning for 7 years. When I came home from work, even if I'd only been gone for 8 hours, he acted like I'd been gone for a year. He was the first thing I'd see in the morning and the last thing I'd see before bed. When Emma was upset, Bailey would go find her and rest his head on her lap. He was part of our family, part of me. Sarah nodded, then asked the critical question. Mister, during the custody exchange on the Friday in question, did you intentionally leave Bailey with Sandra? Yes, confirmed. Sandra asked if Bailey could stay at her place because her apartment has a yard and I had a double shift at work. I agreed because I trusted her, because Bailey was our dog. Well, he was my dog, but Sandra had been part of his life too. I never thought. His voice cracked. He paused, gathering himself. I never thought she would hurt him. Sarah turned to face the jury. Thank you, mister. No further questions. Diana stood abruptly, her jaw tight. The prosecutor was facing an almost impossible situation. She had planned to aggressively cross-examine, to punch holes in his testimony, to reinforce the narrative of a man lying to cover his guilt. But the image of Bailey, trembling, crying, struggling to reach the defendant, hung over everything she tried to do. Mister, she began, her voice sharp, isn't it convenient that you're blaming your ex-wife? Isn't it convenient that you now have a conspiracy theory that absolves you of all responsibility? It's not a theory, said calmly. Doctor found evidence of thyroid medication purchased in advance. Detective found financial transfers to my neighbor. These aren't theories, they're facts. Diana pressed harder. Facts that could be interpreted another way, facts that. Objection, Sarah called out. The witness isn't on trial for interpreting facts. He's on trial for animal cruelty, and the facts clearly show. Sustained, Judge Harrison ruled. Ms., if you have questions for the witness, ask them. Don't make arguments. Diana's frustration was visible. She tried several more aggressive lines of questioning, but remained steady. Each time the prosecutor pushed, the jury seemed to subtly shift further away from her. They had witnessed something that transcended legal arguments. They had seen a man reunited with the dog he loved. Finally, Diana stepped back. No further questions. Now came the moment Sarah had carefully orchestrated. She called her expert witness, Doctor, the veterinary behaviorist from the University of Tennessee. Doctor was a woman in her 50s with an air of academic authority and genuine warmth. She took the stand with the composure of someone who had dozens of times before. Sarah guided her through her credentials, advanced degrees in animal behavior, 23 years of professional experience, research published in peer-reviewed journals, hundreds of cases involving traumatized animals. Doctor, Sarah began, in your professional opinion, what behavioral responses would you expect to see from a dog that had been deliberately starved and abused by its owner over an extended period? Doctor leaned forward slightly. Based on established behavioral science and my personal experience, a dog subjected to abuse and malnutrition by a specific person would display one or more of 3 clear responses when encountering that person. Fear-based behaviors including cowering, tail tucking, and attempts to escape. Avoidance behaviors, including moving away, refusing to make eye contact, or hiding, or aggressive behaviors including growling, snapping, or showing teeth. These are instinctive survival responses. Dogs cannot consciously override them. They're neurological, not learned. And what did you observe in Bailey's behavior when he was brought into the courtroom and saw Mr.? The opposite of everything I just described, Doctor said clearly. I observed a dog experiencing overwhelming recognition and joy. His tail was elevated and wagging vigorously. His body posture was relaxed. He made direct eye contact. He vocalized in the form of whimpering, a sound dogs make to express longing and affection, not fear. He moved toward the defendant, not away. Every single indicator I would use to assess a dog's emotional state pointed to one conclusion. This animal has a strong, positive emotional bond with this man. Diana stood for cross-examination. Doctor, is it possible that Bailey was simply responding to being in a new environment, that his behavior could have multiple explanations? It's theoretically possible, Doctor acknowledged, but highly unlikely. Bailey has been in the courtroom for months. He's familiar with it. More importantly, the specificity of his response, the way he oriented directly toward the intensity of his vocalization, the trembling. These are not generic responses to environment. These are specific responses to a particular person. But you can't know for certain, Diana began. I can know with the same certainty that I know any living creature's emotional state, Doctor interrupted gently. Which is to say, I can observe behavior and draw informed conclusions from scientific principles. A dog that was abused by someone cannot force itself to express love and recognition to that person. It's impossible. Diana sat down, defeated. Sarah called her next witness, the forensic accountant who detailed the financial transfers. The jury barely listened. Their minds were already made up. Then came the final, unexpected moment. Emma's 8-year-old daughter sat in the gallery with her grandmother. She had been quiet through most of the trial, but as Sarah was preparing to call her next witness, Emma began to cry, quietly at first, then with increasing intensity. The grandmother put her arm around the girl, but Emma's sobs continued. She was watching her father, and the weight of months of separation and confusion was finally breaking through her small frame. Judge Harrison noticed immediately. "We'll take a brief recess," he announced. During the break, Sarah approached. "Emma is breaking down. This is actually good. I think we should have her testify. Just a simple statement about her relationship with Bailey and her father." "She's only 8, protested. "I don't want to put her through this." "You're not," Sarah said firmly. "The truth is already putting her through this. But giving her a voice, allowing her to say what she feels, that might actually help her. And it will devastate the prosecution's narrative about you being a dangerous father." When the trial resumed, Judge Harrison asked if Emma was willing to testify. The girl nodded, and she was brought to the stand. She was small enough that her feet didn't touch the ground when she sat in the witness chair. A court officer adjusted the microphone so she could be heard. Sarah approached gently. "Hi, Emma. Your name is Emma, right?" "Yes," the girl whispered. "Emma, can you tell me about Bailey? How long have you known him?" "My whole life," Emma said. "He was here when I was born, my dad told me." "And what was Bailey like?" "He was nice," Emma said simply. "He slept on my bed when I had bad dreams. When I was sad, he would come sit with me. One time I was really sick and Bailey stayed in my room the whole day and night. He didn't leave me." Several jurors were now openly weeping. "Do you think your dad hurt Bailey?" Sarah asked softly. Emma looked shocked by the question. "No, my dad loves Bailey. He talks to Bailey, he feeds him. He took him to the doctor when Bailey was sick. My dad would never hurt Bailey. My dad wouldn't hurt anything." "Thank you, Emma." Diana stood for cross-examination, but was so visibly uncomfortable that she asked only one token question before sitting back down. When Emma was excused from the stand, she walked directly to her father at the defense table, scooped her into his arms, and she buried her face against his shoulder, crying with the relief of finally being able to express something true. Judge Harrison sat silently, his eyes closed for a moment, as if centering himself. When he opened them, he looked at Diana with something close to pity. "Does the prosecution have any further witnesses?" he asked. Diana shook her head slowly. "No, Your Honor, the prosecution rests." In that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood that the verdict had already been decided, not by legal argument but by truth, not by clever prosecution but by the simple, undeniable evidence of love, a dog's love, a child's love, the love between a man and the family that needed him. Sarah glanced at the jury and saw it in their faces, the recognition that they had witnessed something that transcended courtroom procedure. They had witnessed innocence revealed by beings incapable of deception. Judge Harrison turned to the jury. "The evidence is now closed. We'll have closing arguments tomorrow morning. I remind you that your sole duty is to determine whether the prosecution has proven the charges beyond a reasonable doubt." But everyone in that courtroom already knew how they would vote. That evening, Sarah sat within the courthouse hallway, while Emma slept with her head on his shoulder. "It's over," she said quietly. "You're going to be acquitted." Looked at his daughter, then at Sarah. "Because of Bailey," he said simply. "Because of what he did in that courtroom." "Because Bailey told the truth," Sarah corrected. "And sometimes the truth is more powerful than anything a lawyer can argue." Friday morning arrived cold and gray, the Tennessee sky hanging low over Nashville like a heavy blanket. Had barely slept, oscillating between hope and terror, between belief in vindication and fear of betrayal. He sat in his jail cell, still unable to afford bail, and tried to prepare himself for closing arguments. Sarah arrived at the courthouse looking like a general preparing for a final battle. She wore a deep blue suit that conveyed both authority and compassion. She had reviewed the testimony a dozen times. She knew exactly what she needed to say to turn what the jury had witnessed into a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Word had spread through the legal community and the local news. This case had become something larger than a simple animal cruelty charge. It had become a test of whether justice could prevail in the face of calculated deception. Judge Harrison took the bench at precisely 9:00 a.m. "We have closing arguments this morning, followed by jury instructions and deliberation. Ms., you may begin for the prosecution." Diana stood, attempting to project confidence despite knowing she had lost. She spoke for 40 minutes about the photographs of Bailey's condition, about the veterinary reports documenting neglect, about the timeline that supposedly implicated. But her words fell flat. Even she seemed to recognize that she was fighting against something she could not defeat. "The evidence is clear," she concluded desperately. "The dog was in Mr.'s care. The dog was neglected. Mr. is responsible. I ask you to convict on all counts." She sat down. Then Sarah stood. She approached the jury box slowly, deliberately, her eyes making contact with each juror. She began not with legal argument but with human truth. "You have witnessed something in this courtroom that most people never witness in their entire lives," she said quietly. "You have witnessed unconditional love. You have witnessed a dog, an animal incapable of lying, incapable of deception, incapable of performing emotions it doesn't feel. You have witnessed that dog's genuine reaction to a man the prosecution claims abused and starved him." Sarah paused, letting that sink in. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Bailey's trembling, his whimpering, his desperate attempt to reach. They want you to believe that this is the response of an abused animal to its abuser. But we heard from Dr., a veterinary behaviorist with 23 years of experience and peer-reviewed research published in the most respected journals in her field. That what you witnessed was impossible if had abused that dog. A traumatized animal cannot force itself to express love to its abuser. The brain doesn't work that way." Sarah turned slightly, pointing to the evidence table. "You have financial records showing that Sandra purchased thyroid medication in advance. You have security footage showing Sandra bringing Bailey to the shelter. You have medical evidence showing that Bailey's deterioration followed a specific pattern consistent with medication withdrawal, not general neglect. You have a detective who found suspicious payments to a witness. These aren't theories. These are facts. She walked back to the jury box, her voice becoming even more intense. But most importantly, you have the testimony of an 8-year-old child. Emma told you in her simple and honest way that her father loves animals, that he cares for them, that he would never hurt anything. And you have the testimony of himself, a man facing the destruction of his life, facing the loss of his daughter, facing prison time, and he didn't break down under cross-examination. He didn't contradict himself. He didn't become defensive or angry. Why? Because he was telling the truth. Sarah let silence fill the courtroom for a long moment. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. They must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But what they've actually done is create reasonable doubt. They've created more than doubt. They've created proof of innocence. The evidence in this courtroom doesn't just suggest that is innocent. It demonstrates it, conclusively, undeniably. She returned to her seat. I ask you to return a verdict of not guilty on all counts. Justice demands nothing less. Judge Harrison then provided extensive jury instructions about the burden of proof, the presumption of innocence, the standard for reasonable doubt. It took nearly an hour. Then the jury was dismissed to the deliberation room. The waiting began. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Sat in a holding cell, unable to eat, barely able to breathe. Sarah worked in her office, reviewing files, trying to distract herself from the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. Remained in the courthouse, unable to leave. 6 hours passed. Then 7. When the bailiff finally appeared and said the jury had reached a verdict, his heart nearly stopped. 7 hours seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. It suggested thoughtful deliberation, which could mean anything. Was brought back to the courtroom, his legs moving mechanically. He sat at the defense table with Sarah beside him. The gallery filled with spectators, news reporters, legal observers, court personnel who had followed the case. Judge Harrison entered. The jury has reached a verdict. Would the foreperson please stand and read the verdict? An older man, the same juror had noticed wiping away tears when Bailey entered the courtroom, stood slowly. He held the verdict sheet in trembling hands. In the matter of the state versus, on the charge of animal cruelty in the first degree, we find the defendant. The courtroom held its breath. Not guilty. A small cry escaped from the gallery. Sarah Grabb's hand. On the charge of animal cruelty in the second degree, we find the defendant. Not guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant. Not guilty. On all remaining charges, we find the defendant. Not guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. People stood and cheered. The prosecutor's face went white with shock. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, but even he seemed to be allowing the outpouring of emotion. Sarah turned and embraced as he collapsed into tears, not gentle tears, but deep, wrenching sobs of relief and vindication, and the weight of months of injustice finally lifting. Emma, watching from the gallery with her grandmother, screamed, "Daddy," and ran toward her father, stood and scooped his daughter into his arms as she sobbed against his chest. Judge Harrison finally regained control of the courtroom. "Order, order, I need order." When silence was finally restored, Judge Harrison spoke directly to. His voice was unusually kind. "Mister, I want to formally acknowledge this verdict. You have been found not guilty on all charges. You are hereby exonerated and released immediately. I apologize on behalf of the judicial system for the ordeal you have endured. The evidence presented in this trial was clear and compelling. You are free to go." The courtroom erupted again, but this time Judge Harrison allowed it. He stood himself, an unusual gesture of respect. As bailiffs began to process release, Sarah pulled him aside. "There's something else, something I arranged as a surprise." Minutes later, Doctor walked into the courtroom carrying Bailey. When Bailey caught scent, the dog's entire body began to shake. But this time there was no leash restraint, no legal proceeding, no formality. When released, the dog, Bailey ran directly to and jumped into his arms. Collapsed to his knees, holding the dog against his chest, Bailey licking his face frantically, both of them shaking with emotion. Emma threw her arms around her father and Bailey simultaneously, and the three of them, man, child, and dog, became one unit of love and relief and vindication. Every person in that courtroom witnessed it. Even the prosecution team watched in silence, understanding that they had just experienced a verdict written not by jury deliberation, but by the convergence of truth, justice, and love. Judge Harrison stood at his bench, watching the reunion. He looked at Sarah, who was smiling through tears. Then he looked back at Emma and Bailey, a family reunited, and something in his expression suggested that in all his 30 years on the bench, he had never witnessed anything more beautiful than this moment. The judge looked toward the prosecutor's table, then said quietly, "Ms., I'd like to see you in my chambers. I have some concerns about the evidence that was presented in this trial and the decisions made regarding this investigation." Later, it would be learned that Judge Harrison recommended that the district attorney's office investigate how Sandra's conspiracy had been overlooked for so long. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the simple, undeniable fact that justice had prevailed. Was innocent, proven innocent, vindicated before his community, his daughter, and the animal that had silently spoken the truth when words alone could not. 6 months after the verdict, sat on the porch of his small house on the outskirts of Nashville, Bailey resting contentedly with his head on his lap. Emma played in the yard with other children, normal, happy play that had been stolen from her during the dark months of false accusations and separation. The golden retriever's coat shone with health and vitality. His eyes were bright. His tail wagged whenever Emma came near. This was the life had fought for. This was worth every moment of suffering. The legal aftermath had been swift. Sandra had been arrested within weeks of acquittal. She faced charges for conspiracy, filing false reports, animal cruelty by proxy, and fraud. Her trial lasted only 4 days. With the evidence Sarah had gathered, the medication purchases, the financial transfers to Tom Henderson, the security footage, there was nowhere for Sandra to hide. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Tom Henderson, Sandra's cousin, had taken a plea deal. His cooperation in providing testimony about the payments and Sandra's instructions to report Bailey as abandoned had reduced his sentence significantly. But he would spend 18 months in prison for his role in the conspiracy. The case had become known throughout Tennessee as Bailey's Justice, a landmark example of how animal behavior could reveal truth in ways that transcended human testimony. Sarah Martinez's life had transformed completely. Within 3 months of acquittal, she had officially launched Bailey's Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to defending people wrongly accused of animal cruelty. The case had received national attention. Legal journals had published articles analyzing Sarah's strategy. Law schools had begun discussing the ethical implications of using animal behavior as evidence. 3 months after the verdict, Sarah's nonprofit had already taken on 8 cases. By the 6-month mark, she had handled 42. She had hired additional attorneys, trained a team of paralegals, and established partnerships with veterinary behaviorists across the country. The nonprofit's headquarters was no longer a converted house, but a proper office building donated by a local businessman who had been moved by the case. Sarah sat in her office one evening, reviewing files when called. It had become a weekly ritual, checking in with the woman who had saved his life. "Bailey's been acting strange," said, concern evident in his voice. "He keeps going to the window and looking out like he's waiting for someone." Sarah smiled. "He's probably sensing that I'm coming by tomorrow. Dogs know things. They sense the future better than we ever could." The next evening, when Sarah arrived with, Bailey's behavior confirmed his premonition. The dog went wild with joy, jumping and spinning, greeting both women with the kind of enthusiasm that could only come from genuine affection. Had also significant changes. Her work with case had elevated her status in the veterinary community. She had been invited to speak at international conferences about forensic veterinary medicine. She had published 3 peer-reviewed papers on using behavioral evidence in animal cruelty cases. And most significantly, she had become an expert witness in courts across the country. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike now called her for consultation. Her testimony, always grounded in science, always delivered with quiet authority, had transformed how courts viewed animal welfare cases, but was most proud of one specific accomplishment. She had worked with a coalition of animal welfare organizations to lobby for changes in state law regarding animal cruelty accusations. The result was Bailey's Law, Tennessee legislation that required independent veterinary behavioral assessment in all animal cruelty cases before charges could be filed. The law had already prevented 3 false accusations in the state and served as a model for similar legislation in 5 other states. "We never would have caught Sandra without you," told one evening, as they watched Bailey and Emma play together. "We never would have freed you without Sarah," replied. "And we never would have made Bailey come into that courtroom if we didn't all believe in the truth. It wasn't me. It was all of us." But perhaps the most surprising outcome involved Judge Robert Harrison. The veteran judge had written a detailed memo to the district attorney's office criticizing the investigative shortcuts that had led to false accusation. That memo had sparked a complete review of the animal cruelty unit's procedures. 3 investigators had been retrained. 2 junior prosecutors had been reassigned. And Judge Harrison himself had become an advocate for animal behavioral evidence in the judicial system. At a legal conference 6 months after the verdict, Judge Harrison gave a speech titled, "When Truth Speaks Without Words." In it, he discussed the Bailey case and what it had taught him about justice, evidence, and the importance of remaining open to unconventional approaches to finding truth. "I have been a judge for 30 years, he said in the speech, which was later published in the Tennessee Law Review. "I have seen many verdicts. I have believed that I understood how justice worked. But one case, the case of Bailey, taught me that sometimes our most cherished assumptions about evidence and truth must be challenged. A dog entered my courtroom, and that dog taught me more about justice than I had learned in 3 decades on the bench." We must be humble enough to recognize when the traditional mechanisms of the law fail us, and brave enough to try new approaches when the stakes are this high. News of the speech reached who wept reading it. He framed it and hung it in his home office, a permanent reminder that even when the system failed him, it could be corrected by people willing to fight for truth. 1 year after the verdict, Sarah organized a reunion at her office, came with Emma, arrived with Detective James, who had re-examined the case and provided crucial testimony at Sandra's trial, attended as well. Even Judge Harrison came, arriving in civilian clothes rather than his judicial robes, which felt appropriate for a gathering of people who had become, in their way, a family bonded by justice. Bailey was present too, of course, greeting each person with the kind of joy that only a dog can express. As the group stood together, looking at photographs from the trial on Sarah's office walls, Emma asked a simple question. "Why did Bailey have to go to court? Why couldn't you just tell everyone he was nice?" The adults exchanged glances. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level. "Because sometimes people don't believe words," Sarah explained gently. "Sometimes they need to see the truth for themselves. Your dog showed everyone the truth about your dad. Bailey made them believe what was true." That evening, as the group dispersed into the Nashville night, walked with Bailey and Emma through the downtown streets. They passed the courthouse where his fate had been decided. He passed the animal shelter where Bailey had been held. He walked past Sarah's office, where his life had been saved not by legal brilliance alone, but by the combination of truth and love and the refusal to accept injustice. 6 months later received an unexpected letter. It was from a woman in Alabama whose husband had been falsely accused of animal cruelty. She had heard about Bailey's justice and Sarah Martinez's case had given them hope. Sarah had taken their case. 2 weeks later, that man was acquitted, his dog safely returned, his name cleared. Bailey's impact had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. For every person encountered who knew his story, there were others whose lives had been changed by the precedent his case established. Defense attorneys across the country now consulted with veterinary behaviorists. Judges became more skeptical of animal cruelty accusations without thorough investigation. And most importantly, innocent people began to believe that justice, real justice, was possible. On a quiet evening 1 year after the verdict, sat with Bailey and Emma on his porch, watching the Tennessee sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Emma had fully recovered from the trauma of separation. She was thriving in school, secure in the knowledge that her father loved her and that truth ultimately prevailed. Bailey was old for a dog. He would be entering his senior years soon, but he was healthy and content, surrounded by the people he loved. Looked down at the dog resting against his leg and whispered something he'd whispered 1,000 times since that day in court. "Thank you, buddy. Thank you for saving us." Bailey's tail thumped gently, and his dark eyes closed in contentment. The legal system was imperfect. It could be manipulated. It could be corrupted by people willing to destroy innocent lives for their own benefit. But it could also be corrected. Truth could prevail. Love could triumph. And sometimes, when everything else failed, an animal's honest heart could speak louder than any human argument. That was Bailey's legacy. Not just the acquittal of one innocent man, but the reminder that in a world often filled with deception and corruption, truth, when witnessed directly, remains absolutely undeniable. In courtrooms across the country, Bailey's name had become synonymous with one simple principle. Sometimes justice requires us to listen not just with our ears, but with our hearts. Sometimes the most powerful evidence cannot speak in words. Sometimes it can only be seen in the trembling of a dog who remembers the man who loved him, and in the unconditional honesty of an animal incapable of lying. That was Bailey's truth. That was Bailey's justice. And one day, when Bailey was old and gray and finally laid to rest, would ensure that his story was told and retold, not as a legal precedent, but as a reminder to everyone who heard it: truth exists. Justice is possible. And sometimes the most powerful voice in a courtroom is the one that makes no sound at all. The end.